Hello everyone and welcome to today's Creative Climate Chat where we'll be joined by Nick Merriman. For those of you who haven't joined us before, Creative Climate Chats are live conversations with leading thinkers in culture and climate. And so far we've had conversations around the just transition, new economics for a regenerative economy, the net zero carbon challenge and climate justice. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The conversation today is being recorded, so your microphones and videos have been turned off. There will be some space for Q&A at the end of the session, so please use the Q&A function for any questions that you have throughout, and you'll see that at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat and select all panelists and we'll try to respond. So our colleague Ruby is working behind the scenes on that for you. If you have any accessibility issues, today's session is being live captioned, so you'll be able to see the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen as well. Please do join in the conversation on your preferred social channels, and you can use the hashtag Creative Climate Chat. Please do copy the handles Julie's Bicycle and at Horniman Museum. And you will have seen as you were entering that we've asked you to use the chat box to share links to climate stories that are helping you to stay inspired and motivated towards action. Please do keep those coming. We'd love to share some more towards the end of the session. It'll be really great to keep that motivation going throughout these tricky times. And finally, we are fully booked and we're live streaming today's session. So Ruby will be sharing that link in the chat with you in a moment. Please feel free to share the streaming link with others and ask them to join in the conversation on social media and elsewhere. So I'll now hand over to my colleague Lucy, who'll begin the chat with Nick.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Farah, for that introduction. So my name is Lucy Latham. I'm Arts Council England and Policy Programmes Lead at Julie's Bicycle. And today we are focused on the role of museums in climate action and justice. And Julie's Bicycle has had the pleasure of working with many of our brilliant museums, and with the support of Arts Council England, we've produced the Museum's Environmental Framework in 2017. And it's a compilation of actions, ideas and case studies, and you can find it on our website. We'll circulate a link in the chat box. And at a time when building a sustainable society is more pressing than ever, the unique role of museums as custodians of the past and interpreters of the future has never been more important. And today I'm really delighted to welcome Nick Merriman. And Nick Merriman has been the CEO of the Horniman Museum and Gardens since May 2018. Before that, he was director of the Manchester Museum, where he focused its mission on promoting understanding between cultures and working towards a sustainable world. And in 2020, the Horniman launched a climate and ecology manifesto, outlining their platform for action to mitigate against the climate emergency by putting the environment at the heart of mission, programming and collections. Nick is also chair of the National Museum Directors Council for Environment and Ecology subgroup. So first of all, hi Nick, thanks so much for joining us today. I hope you are able to unmute yourself. Can the host please unmute Nick?
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Lucy, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Brilliant. So I will kick off the chat before we open out for other people's questions. So Nick, could you tell us a little bit about the Hornimans' environmental journey so far? What led up to announcing the climate and ecological emergency, and what's happened since?
Yes. Okay. Well, as you said, I joined the Horniman 2.5 years ago. And one of the great things about coming into a new institution is that you can look at it with a fresh pair of eyes. And it was fairly clear to me that the Horniman was really financially sustainable, pre-COVID, of course, that is, in that it actually increased its commercial income. It had got a really thriving membership scheme. It had actually increased its visitors to nearly 1 million on site. So fantastic. But it had lost something, I think, of its social and environmental sustainability. So I got all the staff together, consulted externally and so on about what the Horniman is for, because it wasn't clear. And we fairly rapidly realized that we were actually the only museum in London where you can see nature and culture side by side at a global level. You know, we've got the Natural History Museum, and then all the other museums in London are essentially cultural museums. So that put us in a really interesting potential position. We'd also done some work with visitors to learn more about them and their interests. And we have a majority family audience at the Horniman, mostly local, mostly repeat visitors, very loyal over many generations. And most of the children visitors are pretty young children. We found out from the parents, grandparents, carers, uncles and aunts who were bringing the kids, was they were really worried about the future that these children would grow up into as we did or didn't meet climate, carbon reduction targets and so on. So we realized there was a real appetite for understanding what people might do, because they reported feeling overwhelmed by the issue of the rainforests burning or glaciers melting, and what could they do other than kind of recycle their rubbish, which seemed a bit sort of feeble. So they're kind of really engaged, but unclear of what to do. So after a while, we did revamp the mission of the Horniman, which was essentially to work with our collections and our assets and our visitors to create a positive future for the world we all share. So it's about global and local, and it's about being positive and taking actions, creative actions. So that was our basis. So that meant that the sort of twin issues of environmental and social justice became absolutely central to our mission. So that was sort of in 2018. We then moved in 2019, when a number of other cultural organizations were doing this, to declare a climate and ecological emergencies, because we said it's not just about climate, it's also about pollution, whether it's plastic pollution or air pollution from the South Circular Road, which goes past us and so on. So climate and ecological emergency. But again, like many, we said, well, and this also relates to Black Lives Matter more recently, it's very easy to say something, but actually what counts is doing something. So we then said, well, what are we going to do, having declared an emergency? And we spent a bit of time on that. And as you mentioned, in January this year, which seems an age ago, but it was still this year, we launched our Climate and Ecological Manifesto. So, okay, yes, it's words, it's a manifesto, but it does commit us to certain actions within a particular timescale. And it's backed up by a much more detailed climate and ecology action plan, with a climate and ecology action coordinator, Carol Destry, who you and I, Lucy, were talking about before we went live. And her job is to kind of hold us to account and galvanize the organization to actually undertake those actions. So I'll pause there, but I can go into a bit more detail about what we've actually been doing, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I just thought about when you were talking, I wondered if since bringing in the manifesto, has it kind of changed the tone of conversation internally? You know, if you're in all your managers together, do you sort of talk about the issue in a different way?
Yes, I think absolutely. When I came, like many museums, and of course with Julie's bicycle support, and we're Arts Council funded, and so on, we'd been doing a sort of environment action plan, and we had a committee, but it was somewhat tangential. It was sort of the attendees were people who were enthusiasts, and it didn't have a link to the central mission of the museum. So I now chair that group, and it is central to the delivery of everything around, particularly around the environment and ecological actions. So the conversation about climate and ecology, or environment and ecology, is pretty central to everything we do. So we challenge ourselves now about how any actions contribute to that agenda. So yeah, I think that's the flip, really. It's gone from kind of nice to do with enthusiasts to central to mission.
Absolutely. I mean, that is just the direction of travel we hope all organizations will take. So what's maybe your one of your kind of key or personal favorite projects that you've been doing?
Well, the things that we're doing in our manifesto and action plan really are in two areas, and I'll single out one from each. The first one is what most organizations are aspiring to do, which is basically get our house in order. So we're committed to being greenhouse gas neutral by 2040 and so on, and reducing waste and all those things. And the second is using our public reach and public trust to galvanize people to take actions themselves as active citizens. And so engaging a large public, because we think, if we've got nearly 1 million visitors on site, that's we're in mass media almost. So in terms of getting our house in order, actually, we're creating an energy centre, because one of the big things that all museums and galleries have got to do is get out of gas. And it's equivalent really to the infrastructural changes that happened in museums and galleries when they moved from coal heating with fireplaces and so on to hot water heating through radiators powered by gas. And I understand from more technically minded colleagues that actually, if you're going to, for example, renewable electricity for your heating, but it'll probably still through hot water, you actually have to change all the pipes in the radiators to make them bigger. So we've actually got to do that. So we're moving away from our gas boilers to short term make them more efficient, but then we're creating a separate, as part of that, we're creating an energy centre, which will be where we get our renewables through solar, through ground source heat pumps, and through renewable electricity supply through the grid. So a sort of mixed use. And that'll take a number of years to do, but that's the preparation. And the second thing, in terms of galvanizing the public, the nice one is we have an amazing aquarium in the Horniman, which is the first place in the world to breed coral in captivity. And we've accelerated that. That's a separate story, but we've got a lovely aquarium. And last year, for World Oceans Day, and then for 2 months afterwards, we replaced a lot of the fish and the jellyfish with plastic rubbish to make a point about plastic pollution in the oceans. And it was really shocking. Even for our colleagues, it was shocking, because people expect museum cases to look nice, not to have a load of rubbish in them. And we took out all of our jellyfish, normally a very beautiful tank with jellyfish floating around, and replaced them with white plastic bags that were beautifully floating around as well. And so an anecdote, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old child came in with her mother, and she was so kind of affected emotionally and galvanized by this. She went home and did a 20-page booklet on plastic pollution, which they sent to their local MP.
Wow.
Who promised to sort of look into it more. So it's that kind of direct activation of our audience that we aspire to, because it's only by citizens taking action politically and with corporations that we're really going to get the large-scale movement for change that we need. Just museums getting their own house in order isn't enough.
Absolutely. And the arts, provide such a brilliant space for those kind of journeys to happen within. And you mentioned, those two words, activation and galvanizing, which is a very handy segue to my next question. Horniman is one of our wonderful contributing organisations to the Accelerator programme supported by Arts Council England. And your sort of project, we're working with Carol and Kirsten, and thinking about engagement and communications, how you sort of deploy those kind of messages or ask those questions, get people to think differently, both within the sector and your community. So what does that kind of mean in practice? And do you have any hopes over maybe the next few months even? How does maybe messaging change from being in lockdown to hopefully beyond?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Accelerator programme is great because it's allowed us to work with other like-minded organisations on developing our own project. And our own project stems, as you say, absolutely from this idea of how we can move from sort of broadcasting to a passive public a load of information, which kind of they're again overwhelmed by, to engaging people often emotionally and galvanizing them to action, for positive action for environmental change, as we say. So our idea has been to create an environmental champions club. Now, we have a membership. We have over 8,000 family memberships with about 32,000 people in them. So that's quite a big group. We're intending, with the support of Julie's Bicycle and Arts Council, to develop the idea. Our idea is to recruit 500 families who will commit to being environmental champions with the Horniman scheme, and commit to making certain changes in their own lives to live more sustainably. And that could be obviously reducing their carbon footprint, recycling, reducing consumption, etc., etc. We hope it'll be led by the kids as much as by the adults. And so it'll be a club in the sense that there'll be badges and rewards and so on. Crucially, the club will provide them an arena for support and tips and tools, inspirational talks from key speakers, which is exclusive to the clubs, that sort of thing. And hopefully they can share their journeys, what worked well and what didn't work well. And I think the idea of it is that if it works as a pilot, it could be rolled out by any organization with a membership. I mean, and think of, for example, the National Trust galvanizing its membership. And this could really potentially be scaled up, and it could be scaled up worldwide. And we've already talked to a group called People and Planet, who are interested in some of them taking it on sort of internationally. So that's something that we've been developing. We would hope very much we're waiting actually for a funding bid outcome in the next few weeks, but we hope to launch it at the turn of the year. And it's very much a message of hope. We can, both during lockdown and as we emerge or as we learn to live with the virus, we've seen some of the advantages of things quietening down in terms of people being able to, people traveling less and seeing nature emerge. And so I think there's been a positive message there about how quickly things can bounce back. And I think there's a positive message that people can make a difference in their own lives, and then that can aggregate to something actually quite large if people all make small changes in their own lives. So it's about saying that don't be overwhelmed. You can make a difference, and those differences can aggregate to something huge and positive. And it's about looking forward, because I mean, one of the things that we've found out about, of course, as I mentioned, people often feel overwhelmed when they're just given the facts. You know, this is what's happening to this particular area. These are the things that are going wrong. But psychologists, environmental and behavioral psychologists, show that one of the ways people can get out of that feeling of being overwhelmed is by appealing to the love of family, particularly the next generation. And the Environmental Champions Club actually is a part of a much wider project we're doing called Nature and Love, which is about engaging people with the love of the next generation, whether it's their grandchildren or their nieces, to actually try and do something positive for them, rather than something abstract for a much larger scale nature in general.
Lovely. And out of interest, this may be a bit unfair to spring this on you, but when you were talking about nature bouncing back, have you had any interesting nature spots in the Horniman Gardens over the lockdown period?
Yes, amazingly. We've got a half-mile long nature trail, which is one of our great hidden assets. And in fact, our Nature and Love project wants to open up access to it much more. But we set camera traps and we got deer on it for the
Oh, wow.
This is, deer in Lewisham. It's not a big wildlife area. And we've also noted that our foxes during lockdown, and our gardens did remain open, but they were a bit quieter. They got really used to just wandering around. So when people came back in larger numbers, the foxes were they were actually a slight problem because they were coming up and begging food from people's picnics and so on. But yeah, we have noticed more animals coming out and being bolder.
Great. Well, the foxes and picnics sounds like it could be a bit of a challenge, but I quite like seeing foxes around London. I think they're pretty cool animals. And I think your deer beats my 2 hedgehog sightings, but in a very urban environment, that has been pretty amazing. And that corridor sounds gorgeous. I love that idea. And there's so much about the way we care for nature, which is about giving to future generations. Even the act of planting a tree, or people being involved in rewilding and creating woodlands. We don't necessarily see the outcomes of that act. You're doing it really as a gift to the future.
Yes, and by the way, when we declared our climate and ecological emergency, we planted a tree with a plaque to commemorate it.
Nice. So, I mean, obviously, the work you're doing now is brilliant and inspiring, but you've been exploring this intersection between museums and sustainability for quite a long time now, over 10 years, I'm given to believe. So from being at Manchester Museum in those early days of Manchester Arts and Sustainability team to your current role, what would you say you've learned, maybe on a kind of professional and, if you will, on a personal level?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I've learned, as I alluded to earlier, really, actions are the thing, and they speak louder than words. And actually, actions can be quite hard. I've often been quite disappointed how slow things are to change. And actually, during lockdown, we did a reset agenda for the Horniman around social justice and environmental justice, and said we've got to accelerate these things. If we declared an emergency, we've got to act as if it is an emergency, like your house is on fire, as Greta Thunberg has said. So do things. And part of that is don't aim for perfection. I think quite sometimes in lots of areas, there are people saying, oh, we can't do that or say that because we haven't got this sorted out, and we're somehow hypocritical if we haven't got perfect recycling of all plastics. How can we do anything? And actually, the perfection or the best is the enemy of the good. And I'm absolutely a massive advocate. Just getting on with it. Be imperfect. Admit your mistakes. Learn from mistakes. Don't claim that you've got everything sorted. And I wouldn't at all claim that the Horniman is a beacon of perfection at all. We're just trying to get on with it, and others, can do the same. And finally, I suppose, and this is often the case, work in partnership with others. We're working with, we actually house the London Environmental Educators Forum. We've been working with a lot of local community activist groups around air pollution, for example, and climate change in general. We can collectively achieve things much greater than we can individually. So that's why it's great to work with Julie's Bicycle and Arts Council and so on. And we're working now much more with Lewisham Council, because their London Borough of Culture year after. And climate and climate change is a really big element of what they're doing, and we're going to be helping them deliver that element of their festival. So yeah, stuff.
Oh, brilliant!
Don't worry about it.
I have to say, we at Julie's Bicycle also come across that challenge as well, of people being afraid if it's not perfect 100%. But I think, as you say, that kind of transparent approach, that we're all on this journey, and actually you create much more sort of space to join and take people with you when we're not putting such tough expectations against ourselves, and we have that freedom to experiment, because we're going to try things. Some things will work and some things won't, and that's really part of improving.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you think then, do you think there's something sort of specific about the role of the museum? Like maybe for you, what is exciting about the museum as a place where these sort of questions and ideas come together?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is a unique role for museums in all of this agenda, because museums are some of the very few institutions which are there to take a really long-term perspective. In other words, we're supposed to hold our collections for posterity, whatever that means, but some time in the long distant future. And museums in general, and some specific museums, hold collections going right back to the beginning of the Earth, or even earlier, from meteorites. And say at the Horniman, we've got examples of material from the 5 previous great mass extinction events in the Earth's history. So I think it's part of the role of museums to take that long-term perspective, which is beyond the short-term political and funding cycle. And because, we are in the middle of the Anthropocene and the 6th great mass extinction event in the history of the Earth, the science is unequivocal. So this is not a kind of party political issue. I think there's a really exciting and urgent role for museums to show ethical and moral leadership by talking about the long-term impacts of these events beyond short-term funding and political cycles. And the reason we haven't made enough progress is because of short-term thinking of politicians and other, and corporations. So it's organizations like us that actually need to get off the fence and shout out about it. So, and it's this tricky thing about neutrality and objectivity. Now, I think museums cannot be neutral about the climate emergency and the ecological crisis, but they can use scientific rigor to inform what they're saying to anyone who will listen, including their visitors, about the urgency of addressing it, because it is an existential threat, not just to our collections and buildings, but to the lives of everybody in the world. And so it's not a trivial matter. And I don't, apart from, there are, of course, academics and so on, but in terms of cultural organizations, museums have a special place, I think, because that's part of their job.
Absolutely. So I am shortly going to be opening out to our audience. So I will just ask you to get your questions ready. You can use the Q&A box in the Zoom software. So maybe as you're hopefully thinking and putting something together, I'll just finish with my concluding question, which is sort of speaking to this moment in time, which is so devastating for so many across society and across all aspects of the economy, but very much so culture. And this current crisis means that, as I understand, you've had to restrict entry into the museum. And I'm just wondering, what do you think this moment in time, I imagine it's perhaps having some impact on your climate plans, but are you seeing perhaps what the opportunity is as well as the challenge? Is it maybe reframing how you kind of prioritize environmental action? Yeah, just interested in a kind of reflection.
Yeah. Well, I suppose like most organizations, we did use the shutdown after March and now the coming shutdown to really reflect on our priorities. And I think it's a good time to reflect on what the fundamental purpose of the organization is. And as I said, we had done that 2 years previously. So we didn't feel we needed to change the mission hugely. What we did say is that we needed, as I said earlier, to really accelerate actions around climate and ecology, and particularly as well around decolonizing the Horniman, because there's all those separate Black Lives Matter issues that we needed to address. And I think a lot of people, not just in cultural organizations, did see, well, actually, it is possible to imagine a life with less travel, with no flying. And a lot of organizations have, and individuals have, I think, got an increased appetite for dealing with the urgency of addressing climate and ecology. So I suppose that's what we're doing. We're pushing forward even more strongly with the agenda. But of course, yes, we've had fewer visitors coming, and obviously we were closed for a long period like everybody else. So that visitor engagement piece on site has had to be reduced, but we have tried to move quite a lot of it online, ranging from online school sessions. We've revamped our online curriculum to introduce the decolonizing stuff and the climate stuff. So we've revamped our session on rainforest, for example, to take advantage of the pause to actually revamp it. Mm-hmm. As you know, with schools, often you're just running to keep up. It's quite difficult to stop and refresh. So we've been able to do that. We've been able to make further progress on the Environmental Champions Club and so on. So there were other things we could do. So as I said, our gardens stayed open. So we opened a bee garden with a beautiful sculpture by an artist called Jasmine Pradesito, called Flower Girl, which is made of a material that absorbs traffic fumes, nitrogen dioxide and so on. So it's actually, as well as being beautiful, and the bee garden, encouraging bees, it's also doing something about the very high levels of pollution on the South Circular Road outside. And we've introduced air monitoring readouts, which we'll then put into our galleries in due course so people can see how much pollution there is outside. So, I guess we've just been doing what everybody else is, resetting and moving online.
Well, it sounds absolutely fantastic. Almost, like Horniman's becoming a real-time environmental data lab. I mean, that's very cool. Yeah. So I can see we've already got questions, some really great ones here. So first, a question from Emrys. I hope I've pronounced that right. How do we avoid preaching to the converted and instead reach new audiences or communities with our message of climate urgency?
Yeah, it's a really vital question, and one we've been trying to address quite a lot, because it can sometimes seem that a concern around environment and ecology is a sort of middle class concern. And we had anyway, and organizationally, we have concerns about the Hornimans audience not being diverse enough. So we've kind of discussed this at length. And I think there's two things to come out of it. One is that it's not fundamentally the case that it is solely a middle class concern. I've talked to other colleagues in other museums, and working class communities who are usually, and global south communities, of course, who are most impacted by the climate and ecological crisis, are concerned about it, but their voices are not being heard. So, say in a local context, we are already doing and planning to do more outreach to listen to those voices. So part of our reset agenda is also, the first item on it is listening, consultation, and listening to voices that are not currently heard. The second thing is, of course, to try and link much more the environmental and social justice agendas, and part of that, our decolonizing agenda. So I think we can all hopefully accept that these two issues are interrelated, but often they're dealt with as slightly separate programs. So to give you an example, one of the things that we want to do when we can sort of, get back to some semblance of normality is hear the voice of climate refugees who are living locally and whose move to London, often very perilous, has been at least in part, if not wholly, due to climate and ecological change. So hearing from them those global south voices that are impacted by climate, and who are also obviously a much more diverse audience than we currently mostly get, would be really important. But no, it's a really important question that is absolutely central to try and resolve. Otherwise, we're just going to be speaking to an echo chamber.
Absolutely. You mentioned at the sort of beginning, I think a sort of mechanism of understanding maybe people's attitudes or ideas. And we've got a question here from Rachel saying that the consultative approach with your visitors, your community, seems to have been key in the change in direction and creation of your new mission. How did you carry out this sort of consultation or discussion?
Yeah. Multifaceted, I suppose. So as I think I mentioned, we have a community engagement team of 2 people, so it's only small. And we have some long-term relationships with key partners who tend to be the kind of groups who are not usually regular visitors to the Horniman. So they're the harder to reach groups that we have to go out to. So we had sessions with them on the future mission, and once we'd honed in on, the interrelationship of environment and social justice, what sort of things we might do. We added some generic questions to our larger scale visitor survey, which gave us sort of stats and so on. And we held some specific focus group sessions with, key different audience or potential audience segments. And we also had an exhibition about our Nature and Love program, where we asked for comments. We had comment cards, in the exhibition, and also online consultation. So I think mixed methods gave us both qualitative and quantitative attitudes.
Wow, that's a really quite impressive, comprehensive exercise that you did. And I really like hearing of the different, more creative ways as well that people are engaging with ideas. I mean, surveys, you can get really good, rich, comprehensive data, but I'm thinking also of one of Manchester Museum's exhibitions, which they used counters for their attendees to kind of poll as they moved through the exhibition. And, they are a sort of a different kind of data, but a much more kind of, a gentler, maybe more creative way to keep people engaging and feeling like they're almost, co-producing or co-creating. Yeah. So another very good question from Juliet, who I'm sure in this question is probably speaking on behalf of potentially a lot of our audience. How can smaller regional museums begin their journeys to become agents of change in their communities?
Yeah, well, I guess I would hope that the sort of things I've been talking about can happen at any scale. I mean, it's not dependent necessarily on having large resources. I mean, Horniman's a medium-sized museum. We have about 150 staff. So obviously, I'm completely aware some regional museums have 2 staff or 1 staff, very, very small numbers. So I think it's scalable, though. Certainly as I said, work in partnership with others. Often they can bring audiences, solutions and ideas that can be really, really helpful. Sometimes I think some museums feel that it's difficult to get hold of climate and ecology as an issue because it doesn't suit their subject matter. But I've sort of talked about this somewhere else, that if we think about the British Empire and the environmental depredation that the plantations and using different parts of the British Empire as a resource for furniture and goods sold in Britain, every local history museum in Britain will have bits of things made from mahogany or so on. So I think this is part of the historic exploitation of the world is the story of Britain in the industrial age. And therefore, I think every museum should be able to get a handle on it, even if it's historically, but as a starting point. So don't be worried about resources. Do what you can, work in partnership, get started. And as I say, I think you can probably find a subject-related hook if you look perhaps at your collections in a slightly different way.
Excellent answer. There is, I'll just read out a bit of it. Part of another question here that speaks to, I think, a lot of issues sometimes with taking environmental action in the arts, and that's around funding and sponsorship. So one question here is asking whether you've encountered any issues regarding your position on the climate emergency and potential sponsors or partners.
Yeah. Well, I joke to people, I wish I had the luxury of turning down BP sponsorship. No, so we don't have any sponsorship from almost anybody, let alone fossil fuel companies. But,
okay, so you're fine. It's easy.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a genuine issue, and our trustees are clear that with our ethical commitment around these issues, we would not take sponsorship from fossil fuel companies, even if we were offered it. And because it's not a big issue for us, we don't have an ethics committee looking at that. But when I was in Manchester, and Manchester Museum's part of the University of Manchester, I did sit on a gifts oversight group, which did get to grips with the trickiness of fossil fuel sponsorship, et cetera, tobacco and all that. And probably needn't go into that now, but it depends on your position as to whether you believe that fossil fuel companies are legitimately part of the future move to decarbonize, or you feel actually that they've just simply fudged it and it's greenwashing at the moment, which is probably, frankly, what I think.
Yeah, there's a very interesting article circulating at the moment, a sort of expose for Shell HQ. People may have seen it, but it is a fascinating read. But speaking maybe to resistance or potential resistance on a larger or sort of beyond sponsors, we do have another question. Did you encounter any resistance when you reframed your mission? And if so, how did you deal with it?
Hello, Julia. I know Julia. Well, actually, I'm afraid the boring answer is no, because well, I suppose in a way, perhaps unlike the whole decolonizing Black Lives Matter, etc. issue, there's not too many people I can find who are actively anti-climate and ecological action. We don't tend to come across the climate deniers. They don't tend to be our visitors. And therefore their voice doesn't impinge on us very largely, and we would ignore them anyway. So resistance, no. I think as we move much more into the decolonizing agenda, and as we address issues of the future of African collections and possible repatriation, I think we may get into muddier waters. But compared with that, the climate issues seem to be slightly more straightforward.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned before about sort of not trying to be limited by funding. Obviously, that it still can be very much a limit. Ellen is interested in how the strand of your work, did it require significant investment? Did you have success with external funding?
Yeah. Okay, apologies if there's any noise. There's a bit of a noise above me, so I hope you can hear me above it.
We can.
Yeah. Sorry, can you remind me of the question again? I just need to look at it.
It's okay. It's regarding funding. So did you sort of seek external funding? Did it require sort of a big investment?
Well, I suppose the good news is no, in the sense that the manifesto and action plan is all internally done. The two elements, getting our house in order, quite a lot of that is done by own staff's efforts. We have switched to a renewable electricity tariff, which is slightly more expensive, but we've put that into our budgets. The things like moving to a new form of energy centre, they do require capital investment, which we do have to seek funding from our sponsors for. But we're partly government funded. They do understand the need to invest in estates to decarbonise. So we're hopeful there. The Ecology, Environment and Ecology Action Coordinator post is an 18-month post to essentially embed all these processes so that they become part and parcel of everyday life at the Horniman. That was taken from our reserves. We had built up some reserves in order to, actually mainly for sort of capital and our nature and love. But I argued that this was enough priority with our trustees to fund an 18-month post. So we were lucky to have the reserves, but many charities do have to have reserves, and I suppose we felt this was a legitimate call. And we have had external funding for one or two of our initiatives, and some things like the plastic pollution and some of our exhibition, they're just part of our normal program that we have budgets for. So we've shifted what we do. This is what we do. It's kind of, we use our core resources to achieve this. So I don't want to be in a position where something that we see as an emergency and urgent, we're waiting on external funding mainly for. It's the core of what we do.
Great. And then I think this will be our final question. And it's speaking really to the sort of sustainable production techniques in your own exhibitions and work. What kind of actions does the Horniman take in terms of the maybe operational sustainability in your production?
Yeah, I mean, like all museums, we're sort of exercised by this, particularly around exhibitions, which can be terribly wasteful. We've got an in-house workshop team, which is great actually, because they become really adept at recycling. Well, we reuse cases, of course, for all of our exhibitions. We recycle a lot of exhibition walls and infrastructure, vinyls and so on. Mounts in particular, and we make our own mounts in-house, and again, as I say, reuse as many of them as possible. We put our exhibitions on for quite a long time, so we don't do many exhibitions a year. And we've recently developed and got funding for actually a new touring exhibition network called Magnet, Museum and Galleries Network for Exhibition Touring, funded by the Art Fund in its pilot phase, which brings together 12 similar-sized museums, including the Horniman, all across the country, to start sharing their exhibitions. So we've got an exhibition opening in a year's time called Hair, about using our anthropology collections to explore hair cultures, including in Britain. But we're doing it with two other museums in that network, so it'll tour to them. And we're looking at trying to streamline our processes so that touring and all the transport and so on gets much more sustainable. So of course, I mean, the most sustainable thing is not to do any temporary exhibitions. So we don't want to be in that place, but we want to sort of do them as soundly as possible. We are cutting down on international working, and obviously video conferencing tools are helping with that. So we're looking at, we have quite a detailed action plan, as I mentioned, and I chair the group, and we're looking at reducing our carbon footprint right across the board, reusing, recycling, looking at our supply chain. We've got a very good cafe owner who's independent from us, but also absolutely on the same journey, actually more ahead of us, because our cafe is now plastic free. Our shop supply chain is unfortunately not yet quite plastic free, but we're working on it. So it's always a work in progress. We can always do better, but and you wouldn't believe how difficult it is to do some things. We thought, brilliant, we've got gardeners, we've got loads of stuff to compost. We're aiming at composting 97%. These so-called compostable substitute plastic cups made of vegetable fiber, you need to have a really expensive rocket composter to get up to the right kinds of temperatures that will cause them to break down. Otherwise, they sit there for years and years unchanging like plastic. So once you start on this journey, it becomes more and more challenging. But that's why we need to share practice and, work, share tips. There is a conference, National Museum Directors Conference, dedicated to environment and ecology on the 18th and 19th of November. There's a few places, it's free. Do have a look at that if you want to sort of follow up on some of these ideas.
Great. Okay, so our final question for you, Nick, and we end all our creative climate chats with this one. So what would be your climate superpower?
Well, if that means the equivalent of flying or something, I think I'd use the sort of Back to the Future type supercar to go right back to, I think it was 1988, when the Intergovernmental Forum Panel on Climate Change was first instituted. And I'd ensure that the arguments they made were so convincing to all of the politicians at the time that they immediately declared climate and ecological emergencies and took immediate urgent actions to reduce carbon emissions to zero within a 30-year period, so the world would now be carbon zero.
What a good answer. A very useful superpower indeed. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to welcome back my colleague Farah now, who is going to do a recap on some of our inspiring messages, hopefully, that we've received.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick, and to Lucy as well. We'll do a quick recap. So we talked about how nature and culture exist side by side at the Horniman, and how important it is to work with the local as well as the global, and to go beyond climate specifically, to talk about ecology, to talk about social justice, and to really examine what it means to declare a climate emergency. And Nick also talked about what the Horniman is doing to get their own house in order, alongside programming and outreach, and moving on from passively broadcasting messages to their audiences, and moving towards emotive actions, like with the love, engaging people with love. And there's some really important action points and ways to be involved, so not to be overwhelmed by it, to remember that you can always make a difference, and also that listening is really central to getting out of our echo chambers, and to have these conversations with broader communities and people who are not often heard in this conversation, and to make everything make sense to people in their lives, particularly with their families. And another just great important point is about working in partnership and working collectively wherever we can, because we can achieve more when we work together. So that was a really great, broad and interesting conversation. So thank you again so much, Nick. So just to get on to the next steps, so you can keep the conversation going using the hashtag Creative Climate Chat and using the tags at Julie's Bicycle and at Horniman Museum. So we had a couple of really nice, inspiring things coming through in the chat. So we had someone mention Mandy Barker, a photographer whose work could be linked to the work you're doing at the aquarium at the Horniman. And somebody's also mentioned the Climate and Culture Alliance group for museums in Wales, which sound really great. And we'll send these links around at the when we send the recording around, and we're getting a few more really great links through too. So we'll send everything over.
Brilliant. Obviously, everybody is very galvanized after your chat, Nick.
Yes, and just please also sign up to our bulletin to stay in touch with future news and events, and we'll share that link around. This event was also part of the Season for Exchange series of events, which are continuing over this week and next week. The season includes daily conversations with artists, scientists, performances, social media takeovers and workshops, and it's really exciting. So please check out the full program at Season for Exchange. And the final event for the season is happening next Friday, and it's our Creative Green Awards. Everyone is welcome to join us. Please take a look at the Julie's Bicycle website for more information. It's looking to be a really exciting event. And finally, we'll be sending around a really, really quick survey at the end of this session, and this helps us to improve our webinars and our creative climate chats. So please do help us out by taking a minute to complete this. We'd really appreciate it. If you have any ideas for what you'd like to see us cover or any interactivity that you'd like to see, please also do get in touch. A reminder once again that we're going to send the recording around in the next few days, so you'll see all of this shortly, and please do share it. So once again, thank you so much to Nick and to Lucy and to everyone who's joined us today. That'll be it from us. Bye.